Okay, seeing the presence of a quorum, I will call this meeting of the Union 26 School Committee meeting to order. And I will note that the meeting is being recorded by Amherst Media for later broadcast. And I will further immediately move to enter executive session in accordance with open meeting law, Mass General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 21A, pursuant to Purpose 2, to conduct strategy sessions in preparation for negotiations with non-union personnel, Michael Morris, with no plans to return to open session. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, it is a roll call vote to enter executive session, so we will start down here at the left.
Menino, aye.
Ordona's aye.
Hall, aye. Stancer, aye. McDonald, aye.
Demling, aye. And we are in executive session.
And I will call this meeting of the Amherst-Pelham Regional School Committee to order, in the presence of a quorum at 6:32. And we'll move to enter executive session in accordance with open meeting law, Mass General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 21A, pursuant to Purpose 2, to conduct strategy sessions in preparation for negotiations with non-union personnel, Michael Morris, and to approve executive session minutes that don't include Union 26 as a joint item. Has been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Begin a roll call vote of regional members over here. Menino, aye.
Ordona's aye.
Stancer, aye. McDonald, aye.
Nakajima, aye.
Demling, aye.
Spitzer, aye.
Sullivan, aye.
Okay, and we will return to a public session immediately afterwards.
Literally doing our homework.
Okay. We are returning to open session. The Amherst-Pelham Regional School Committee. The first order of business is going to be approval of the minutes. I just thought I'd say, for the committee's benefit, that September 10th minutes are withdrawn for the moment, are going to be reviewed and then returned in our next packet. So if you have any edits to it, you can email them to Dr. Morris, but otherwise we're only going to be moving forward with August 29th. So, are there any people that had a chance to review? Yes.
I just have a procedural question, because I believe that we had approved the minutes from August 29th at our last meeting. And so I guess I was confused why we would be approving them again. I'm just sure if I was missing something. Let's see, Dr. Moore.
Yes.
There were a couple edits that were requested, and so I know they're draft minutes, we're not gonna talk about from the 10th, but there was a decision, there was a couple, there's enough edits that the committee, I think, decided to table it until those edits were made. So there wasn't, my recollection is there wasn't a vote on the meeting minutes of the 29th, because there was a formatting error, and there were two other errors that changed the meaning, so that, I think, instead of voting to approve the minutes as amended, there were enough changes where the committee requested that those changes be made and then
Yeah.
voted at the next meeting.
Yeah. And actually, as Mr. Demling's pointing out, the the minutes that we're not talking about tonight from the 10th actually say Mr. Nakajima proposed that the minutes be edited. So there's actually a future record we'll talk about that discusses the fact that we in fact didn't vote on the minutes. So with that, are there any further edits to August 29th? Otherwise, I'll entertain a motion. Yes.
Move to approve the minutes of Thursday, August 29th.
Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any further additions, comments? Seeing none, all those in favor, please signify by raising your hand. The motion carries with a bunch of A's, and any nays or any abstentions? Abstention, Mr. Demling. So it is 801 is the vote. And it's approved. You okay?
701.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Right.
Because Mr. Funch is absent.
Oh, that's what I was getting earlier. Earlier, I was talking to you guys, and I was saying, I swear to God, we're missing someone. We're missing Mr. Funch.
You are correct. We're correct.
Or rather, you're correct. Good God, that doesn't bode well for this evening. Everyone, hang with me on this.
Calculator?
No, it's okay. Either way, they're now approved 701. with Mr. Demling abstaining. Committee announcements, are there any announcements from the committee at this time? Yes.
I am now the chair of the Budget and Finance Subcommittee. So I just wanted to report that we had a meeting, Sean, Carrie, and I, and Ron. And we went over a calendar of our meetings for the upcoming year of the subcommittee. And also, I wanted to bring up one thing, which is we had talked in the past about having perhaps an additional meeting to go over some of the budget information. And Sean sent out an email last week with the topics that we came up with, and he put some approximate time on it. So I guess the question I wanted to bring forward was, do we set up an additional meeting to cover this, or do we put this on an agenda? His time, he thought it would be probably 2 to 3 hours if we included discussion.
So, forgive me for saying this, as a matter of procedure, item 6 is subcommittee updates.
Oh, I'm
Typically,
sorry.
this is an item that you brought up during subcommittee updates and
May I
discussed
ask
at
a
that time.
question?
Yes, of
Being a
course.
newbie, what's the difference between a committee and a subcommittee?
Committee announcements, meaning as a member of the committee, you have something you want to announce.
Ah, got it.
So
Okay.
it could be better, it could be honestly better titled. It could-
Okay.
At the top. Yes. So-
I have a question for the
Announcements
committee.
from the
I've been in contact with Miss Wellborn and also one of the 3 students who did some fundraising last spring in their work to remove water bottles from the middle school. And they had raised enough funds to put in a hydration station outside the cafeteria in the middle school. And I asked them if they'd like to come in front of this committee and present their work, and they said they would like to. So I'm asking the committee if they would like them to, and to choose a day that they could do that.
Okay. You know, it's funny. We omitted school committee planning as one of the last items of the agenda. So in this case, I'm gonna say that's a perfect time for you to bring this up, Mr. Sullivan, because there's literally no other opportunity in the agenda to do so. Okay, I mean, we're working with Dr. Morris, we'll find a time to do it.
Alright, thank
Sounds
you.
great.
That'd be great.
Any other announcements? Seeing none. We are open for public comment. I'm not suspecting there is any public comment, but we're open at this time. Seeing none. Again, for those people who are watching, as this is taped, I mentioned earlier and later broadcast on Amherst Media. If folks, obviously you're welcome to come to our meetings. You're also welcome to write emails, send traditional stale mail letters, and they're always brought to the attention of the full committee. Look forward to it. I'm gonna say that's out of order. So the next item on the agenda is the superintendent's update.
Sure.
Dr. Morris?
And it's in your packet. And I'll be brief. I know there's a lot of agenda items to get to still this evening. So yesterday was the Puerto Rican flag raising event. I know I've mentioned in superintendent updates prior. It's a great event. We had over 100 people gathered. Middle school and high school students participated in several of the speeches and spoken word. We have elementary students as well, but being this a regional meeting, I was focusing on that. Thanks to Ms. Ordonez, who addressed the crowd on behalf of the school committees, and it was really a beautiful event. I want to publicly thank Dr. Guevara, as well as town staff, for helping organize the event, and things like safety in terms of blocking off the street. There was a lot of things that went into the event going well, and so there was a lot of people who contributed to that. So I just want to thank everyone, and it was great. And there's a picture of some of our staff members who were dancing as one of the as the event went on. I don't know if Ms. Ordonez has anything else you'd like to share on that one. Not to put you on the spot, but
It was a wonderful event, and I think the kindergartners, I believe, who started chanting Puerto Rico, as the flag was raised, was just the perfect ending to the event.
Spontaneously?
Spontaneously.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
also, in terms of student activism and student work, so last Friday was International Climate Strike. A group of high school students organized a bus to Boston and went to the rally there. They met with Principal Jones and I beforehand to work out logistics and understand, implications, for instance, interscholastic athletics and how that worked with MIAA rules. Incredibly responsive and responsible students. They reported to me via email. I checked in with them yesterday, and they reported to me it was just one of the more amazing experiences of their life. There was an incredible number of people in Boston, and we're going to continue to work. There's potentially some grants that I've been informed about that they might be leaders on around bringing topics of climate justice to the larger community, not only in the school community, but to the larger community. So it's really nice that they now have an organized cohort of students who are really passionate about the work. And some of our middle school students, particularly 7th grade students, joined the protest that was happening on UMass campus. We ensured their safety in terms of walking there, and of course made sure that if they came back, that there was a bus to get them home, even if they weren't in school the last couple hours of the day. There were also activities that are for students who are in the schools, a large variety of activities that were led by students and staff to kind of acknowledge the crisis that's going on in the world. Let's just put it that way. Grade Span Advisory Committee met yesterday from 3 to 7. You could see, oh no, it's on the next page, which is better organized than how I had it. As a separate attachment, the agenda was there and the subcommittees. So there's 4 primary subcommittees: procedural transitions, social transitions, academic transitions, and communication public relations. Ms. McDonald is a school committee rep, and she's on that last subcommittee. I felt like an incredible amount of work happened, and one of the pieces that we'll come back to perhaps next time as an agenda item is what's the timeline, what's the role of this committee, the elementary committees. I think there's a lot of questions around that, and Ms. McDonald and her group, I think, made a lot of headway into what that looks like. So without stealing your thunder, just I think it's a good topic when we have a full agenda item, but I don't know if you have other things you'd like to share, but I think a lot of work happened, and summer happened. We didn't meet in the summer, and yet within 15 minutes, everybody was right back where they were and rolling in the work.
Yeah, no, that was a great summary. It was, I missed the second meeting of the group, so this was my second meeting, and the group is, that I am a part of is only 2 people. Myself and Jennifer Ortiz from the HR district office. But when we all came back together at the end of the evening, the share out was really robust, and it was kind of incredible, the depth of discussion and topics that the groups tackled during that short time over pizza. But
Yeah.
but I think the timeline and process and approach, it was informative for myself because I really didn't have a clear understanding myself, but I think also that it sparked a lot of discussion and conversation with the group, and so I do agree that it would be a great topic for the committee to review and discuss in a future meeting.
Mr. Dillon?
I asked last time about CPAC representation. I don't know if you had a chance to reach out to CPAC to confirm whether there's someone explicitly.
So I did not, but it is on my list of, and you reminded me of that, and I appreciate it. So at the time I was going to get to it, I think we corresponded on Friday, which was 3 days before the meeting, and I felt like a little awkward to ask someone to come from 3 to 7 in a short time frame, but we will reach back out. On the next page, we had a Alana event on Saturday. So historically, the last couple years, the Alana Cabinet has planned an event in the spring, and this year, or last year, the Alana Cabinet decided they want to do a fall event to be more inclusive of staff members who are new to the district. That early in the school year might be a good time to build that community instead of waiting a whole school year to have an event like that. So we were at Mill River. It's a beautiful day.
What is Alana?
I'm sorry, Alana is an acronym that we use, that's used a lot in college campuses as well to describe, in this case, staff members of color. It was, a wonderful day, and there was also a very intentional focus on ensuring that people could bring their families, that it wasn't just a staff event, but that actually if people had children, partners that they wanted to bring to the event, that it was about, the goal was really about building community and within the Alana staff, and it's hard to do that if you aren't inclusive of people's loved ones. So, lucked out with the weather. It was great, and kids on the playground, and we had food there, and it was a really successful event.
So your thinking is you're going to do it in the fall and the spring both then? So should I kick off the year at the end of the year?
We haven't gotten that far. So we didn't do a spring event last year. This was planned in lieu of a spring event. And the feeling was the spring has tended to be, well, we've had some successful events, a really hard time for a whole host of reasons getting people there, and felt like an awkward time to build community as we're heading into summer where people won't see each other. So it was more of an intentional shift than a doubling of events. Yep. And middle school open house, just a quick note on this Thursday. And the last thing, and it was happened too late for me to add it to the written document, but the governor this afternoon of Massachusetts banned vaping sales for the next 4 months. So it's news, last night they said, oh, governor's gonna have this big speech on vaping, but I don't think many people were predicting quite this. It was like other states have banned like flavored content of vapes. The town manager of Amherst and I have been in touch because he'll get kind of the implementation guidance, and he'll share that with me. So we were in touch this afternoon, and as I get more information about that, I'll certainly share with the committee. As vaping is currently not legal for students who are in our schools, I think the implications for us on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment level are relatively small, but I think it actually highlights the level of crisis that the Commonwealth is in. So I just wanted to note that, and certainly something we can come back to as the goals sort of indicate this year.
Serena?
I don't know whether less than 18-year-old could order from Amazon.com, but I checked it and I could have delivery on Thursday.
And so I think also to the point Mr. Menino's saying, there's the legal market of vaping, and then there's like many substances, and then there's the not official market. And so this is banning the legal market, and so the implications for the less legal market, I think, remain to be seen. But it's a really strong statement that I haven't seen in other states. Not that I've tracked this, but that the governor is making today.
Like, so further follow-up.
Yeah.
Is there, from anything, like the Department of Public Health, from DESE, is there any guidance? I mean, it's easy to say something is illegal,
Right.
but that's like everyone here has heard that when they were in school,
Right.
right? Like, that's just an easy thing to say.
Right.
I could imagine that there's some students who might want to know, and might ask either their peers or might even ask adults, depending on their relationship to them, what's the crisis now?
Right.
I thought this stuff was safe. It obviously, forget about for people who are minors.
Right.
I'm just saying, if you looked around and said, wait a minute, now apparently people who are of age are no longer allowed to partake of this thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious whether there's any, maybe from Mr. Bockelman, whether there's any sort of advisory or professional information, public information, that you'd contemplate sharing with staff so that there could be better information out there around what actually happened.
Absolutely. So that's what we're looking for, and that's what Mr. Bachman will share with me when he receives it. Before, when you were over in the executive session, one of our high school health teachers happened to be here, and we were talking a bit about it as well, like, what's the message that sends to students, and I think it's hard to predict, right? You look at other points in history where substances were banned and how that was perceived by young people. I think it's not entirely predictable, but we were actually talking about this a little bit earlier this afternoon. As more formal information comes out, it certainly would be shared with the
I
community.
actually meant less the message it sends,
Yeah.
rather than if I heard the governor did this. I didn't see the content of the governor's announcement. If the governor actually indicated that there are again legal adults, so we're not talking about minors,
Right.
who are partaking of vaped products that contain what otherwise are unregulated but perhaps illegal ingredients that have caused side effects that are significant and ending up people in the hospital. Like, that's actually good. If that's true, that's actually good medical information, because I would rather, forgive me for saying this because I'm not trying to be funny, but rather than sort of replicating a constant sort of reefer madness, just saying no, sort of, it's dangerous, what are you thinking?
Right.
I would rather actually that a kid who might otherwise find the availability of vape products know that, no, whatever you think of this normally, apparently there may be something going on right now that is causing an actual physical ailment that people are having trouble figuring out how to deal with or identify, and that's why the governor's banning legal of age people from partaking in this, because we're not sure of the broader medical harm. Like, that's a totally different
Yep,
message
I hear you now.
to
Yeah.
a minor.
Yep.
Sorry, so,
Just to add that was part of his announcement,
Yeah.
that it was a public health crisis, and to bide time to collect the data and study and analyze what's happening.
sorry, I didn't mean to go off on this.
No.
But I just think it's, never mind. You done?
I
Anything
am.
else? Any other questions? There is no chairs update. Subcommittee updates. So what's going on with this extra meeting stuff, whether it's for budget, for budget and finance?
So, there was some discussion at our retreat, I think, about doing a little bit deeper dive into the budgeting processes, and suggested that perhaps we have an additional meeting to do that. So that's an open question,
Right.
I think, for the committee. And Sean, you all should have received that mail that Sean sent out that listed the things that we came up with as a group that we thought would be good to cover. You know, input on that would be appreciated as well.
Anything else, Dan?
Yeah, I think the main thing is, I think we talked about scheduling a special meeting for the budget deep dive, so it's just coming up with a date for that.
You mean right now?
Whatever.
I guess, since we did talk about this in the retreat, I guess the question for the committee would be, did anyone change their mind that this is a good idea? I mean, I'm sorry, I'm being snippy. We did talk about it, and people have questions about the advisability of doing that. Otherwise, what I had heard at the time being was a general sentiment that this was in fact a good idea. I think the challenge of it, just to lay it out further, would be that there was also the sense that if we had new committee members, we thought it was good to do it at a time in which they could participate or get up to speed or learn. So I'm just wondering whether, did you, I apologize, I missed this email. Did you pose potential dates or a window
No.
for this thing?
No, just topics.
Okay, Dr. Morris or Ms. Adonius?
I'll defer to Mr. Donner.
It was just, so I'm just looking at the dates, the sort of topics and calendar outline that was shared with the committee previously. I believe the election here in Amherst is November 5th. And so we had a meeting towards the end of November, if I remember correctly. I can't remember the exact date, but perhaps that would be a good date because we will know who the new committee members are,
Yeah.
but they haven't yet been sworn in, but they could still theoretically, I guess, unless there's some legal reason or, other reason to not have them participate, could participate in something like that. My concern, I think, was having it before Mr. Mangano leaves at the end of this calendar year, because I think given his knowledge of the budget process and
Yeah.
how it typically works, that, I would prefer to have him running it so that he could help answer questions, and perhaps, I don't know if we'll have a replacement by that point. It just seems to sort of make sense to do it sometime before the major holidays.
I agree with that myself, entirely. And the timing makes sense too. I can't think of any reason, because I think you have two ways you can handle the meeting. One is you don't have to take any votes at it at all, in which case you can just have a general conversation, and there's no reason you can't invite in newly elected but not sworn in committee members to participate in a general conversation. Alternately, if there was some reason we thought by the time we got to it, there was some need for any particular votes, then the votes would obviously be limited to members of the committee, not to people who are future members of the committee. So we could do it, we could definitely do that.
I'll just throw this out there, it might not work. We have a 4-town meeting early in December. We could try to make the town-wide part maybe an hour, and schedule this after that, if that works. I don't know how the other agendas work, but it's just, we had that scheduled anyway, so it's a possibility for you to consider if you wanted to group things together, so.
Scott, do you have your hand raised?
Yeah, what is the date of the 4-town meeting?
I believe it's December 7th. If that's a Saturday, then
Yeah, you'll get probably an email tomorrow, if you haven't got it yet. We'll,
Can we find a couple of different dates for this thing? I don't really wanna lock myself in to the idea that we're definitely putting those two conversations together. Among other things, we don't know what those conversations are gonna be like. So it might not actually be the most productive thing to say, let's have a really open and supportive, life-affirming conversation about how you can understand the budget shortly after, whatever conversation we have.
Another
before
life
it ends.
affirming conversation.
Exactly, exactly right. So I mean, the point is keep that as one option, but ideally what Sasha would do is, doodle poll us around that that date and then others around there, and then we'll figure out what we can get to. Is
Okay.
that the feedback you needed?
Yes, it is, thank you.
Great. Any other subcommittee updates? Yes.
So policy subcommittee, we have not met since our last regional full committee meeting, but we are meeting on Monday, October 7th at 5:30 in the middle school superintendent conference room.
Great.
And just at that time, that's when we will be reviewing the Amherst, the policies relative to organization, the committee organization that are impacted by the new charter in Amherst.
Any other subcommittee updates? Seeing none, we'll move forward. Hopefully we can pick up speed at some point. Not in this one. Not in this one. We'll take our time on this one. I just saw what the topic was. I'm like, no disrespect intended. We'll take our time. I would welcome an introduction to this. Sure. Hopefully people had a chance to look at the PowerPoint, the report, or both.
So last spring, we spoke a bit about this. We knew we were going to be looking for our bus contract was ending. And before we went out to bid, we wanted to have someone come in and take a look about the efficiency of our routes, where there are ways to improve our routes, because sort of this is a good time if you're going to make some changes, as opposed to when you're within a contract, and that's a little more binding. In addition, last spring, we talked a bit about late start. It was an agenda topic, I can't remember the date, but in a spring meeting of the Regional School Committee. And since Rich, who is going to be presenting in a minute, both has the knowledge around efficiency of bus routes, but also about the transportation impacts of late start time, we thought we would ask him to tack that on to his report instead of having kind of multi-phases. It was easier to look at it all at once. So we appreciate that he came in. He's done both, the transportation side as well as the late start time side. These kind of reports all over the Commonwealth and some other states. So he comes with a wealth of knowledge, and it was really good to have an objective look at our routes. And one of the things you'll notice, and not to steal your thunder, is that you have how many seats you have to have in a bus and how many riders you actually have in a bus, and that the delta between those can be really significant. And that's really hard for the public to see when they see a school bus come into the middle school and it's going, or leaving the middle school more likely, and you see a bus that's half full and people say, why is it half full? And yet, having to guarantee a seat for every student and have students at Vela and all these other after school things, I think it really gets explained much more fully in the report, and I learned a tremendous amount from reading it. So appreciate you doing that and spending time with us, and we look forward to hearing your report.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Superintendent did ask me two things. Last night he asked me to cut down my presentation. He said this committee is in favor of short presentations, so eliminated a lot of data from the original PowerPoint. So tonight I'm just going to highlight, take a broad view. The detail is contained in the report, but stop me if you have questions anywhere along the line. He also asked me to introduce myself, and I'm a former collaborative director, was director of the Lower Pioneer Valley Collaborative for the better part of 35 years. And over a 7 or 8 year period, about 20 years ago, we got into the school bus business. We assumed the contracts from our member school districts because we could do it better and we could do it cheaper. And that is still in operation today, and it's still a valuable part of what the collaborative does. And so I've had an opportunity since I retired 11 years ago to travel all over the country, doing efficiency studies and doing primarily transportation bidding for those that have a procurement process similar to Massachusetts. And so that's what I bring to the table, and that's the paradigm that I come from. I've done large districts, districts as large as several thousand buses. I've done small districts. The smallest I did was 3 buses. And I've done probably close to 300 or more school districts across the country. And so I've gotten to see a lot, and I think I know a lot. And hopefully the report will show that.
Could you also share, just briefly, I'm sorry to interrupt, just some of the, on the late start time, other districts you've worked with? Just because I know I know some members of the committee have been tracking this across the Commonwealth,
Okay.
so it might be helpful.
Yeah, this past year I did Lexington, Newton, Concord, Groton Dunstable, Barrington, Rhode Island, and I'm doing several more this coming year, both in terms of school reconfigurations, balancing elementary class loads across school boundaries, and reconfiguring transportation. I'm doing 2 this year because districts are opening a new school. They're taking an opportunity to reconfigure and look at their bell schedules as part of that process, as well as reconfiguring their transportation. Those are the ones that I remember off the top of my head.
Perfect.
Right.
All right, so,
Did not work. Was when we tested it. I will do
one of the original things I look at when I look at a district is I look at the size of the district, I look at the infrastructure, the traffic, look at your population, look at your school population versus your town population, and the district, and I say the district, I mean the whole district, is relatively sparsely populated for transportation purposes. What that means is that you're not densely populated, but more importantly, you have over 102 square miles of territory for which you're responsible for transportation. School transportation efficiency is not just the number of kids on a vehicle. It has to do with manual versus computerized routing and scheduling. The person who actually does the routing and scheduling determines how many buses you actually need. The student riders, the scheduled versus your actual riders, which we call student loading. Time available between school starting and ending times, which we call your tier transportation time. The distances and travel time between your schools, how close are your schools together. The population density, number of students per mile of bus travel. And your highway road infrastructure and traffic patterns and traffic congestion. You're much different than Newton or Boston or Providence or any of the urban areas. Again, your morning routes generally drive the number of buses that you require because typically more kids ride in the morning than the afternoon. And that's certainly the case here also. And last, and certainly not least, is the community expectations for the quality of school transportation services. Ideally, everybody wants to watch their child get on and off the bus from their window of their home. How practical that is not very practical. But ideally, there are communities who demand that level of service and are willing to pay for it. So we have to balance the community expectations for service against efficiency and cost effectiveness. And typically, 74 to 78% load capacity ratios is considered efficiency by both the Department of Education and by industry standards. And the reason is that if you try to reach 100%, you can't manage the change from year to year. And also what happens is if you don't have some excess capacity built into your system, what happens is that the first day of school you're going to have a lot of buses that may be overcrowded, and you have havoc for the start of school. So you have some excess capacity built into the system. And that's typically because you schedule more kids than are actually riding. And that's how you account for the capacity differences. A caution we have is that transportation management can sometimes over-consolidate routes in order to eliminate a bus, only have to reinstate it during the year or the following year because it required changes in routes or changes in student population. And as I said, as a result, the transportation system requires some excess capacity. In your case, you have a different length of school day across the district. Your high school, middle school have 6 hour 35 minutes, and others have different times. The length of the school day variance does have a significant impact on the ability to restructure school starting and ending times to maintain transportation efficiencies. And you'll see that as we get into the slides later on.
Just one thing to note, because it may not be common knowledge to everyone on the committee, is that Leverett and Shrewsbury Elementary Schools have an early release every Wednesday, which is different than the other districts as well. So their typical days a little longer, but then they have their early release, and that has large implications. The reason I'm saying it isn't just to let you know, it's because there's implications for the transportation as well.
Staffing, you currently employ a full-time transportation manager and a full-time administrative assistant who's shared with the operations and maintenance department. In addition, district primarily employs full-time drivers who are also shared with operations and maintenance. And I have to say, it's a commendation to the district to do that, because all of the private sector and public sector are struggling to both recruit and retain quality drivers. There just aren't enough drivers around to serve, a quality driver to serve the need that's out there. And because you offer full-time, even though it's split, you have drivers who have higher wages and benefits, and you're able to better recruit and retain quality drivers. Your school contract, you operate a modified two-tier system. High school, middle school is Tier 1. Elementary schools are Tier 2. You share an overall transportation operation amongst the member school districts, and they collectively utilize a combination of contracted and self-employed drivers, and the system's currently contract with Five Star Transportation, 14 buses, and with Kosmeskis, 9. By the way, Five Star has been acquired this past year by National Express, so they'll still run as a subsidiary company, but they are now owned by one of the largest bus companies in the country. Your transportation budget, I will say you have a modest increase over the last 4 years, 0.95% average increase from year to year. I will commend whoever did your bid specs last time, that they used a cost of living increase to manage your budget increases from the first year going forward. Something I've advocated for the last 7 or 8 years, and it's worked out very well for school districts. What it means is that you share the economic risk with the contractor, but what it means on your side is that the contractor is not taking their crystal ball, imagining the worst case scenario 5 years from now, and you pay for it from day one. So you share that cost, and to the extent that you're willing to do that, it makes economic sense. I look at your district versus your transportation expenditures, and one of the benchmarks with regard to cost effectiveness is the percentage of transportation versus your total budget. In your case, you're about 3.35% averaged over the last 5 years. Typically for a rural school district, a total transportation cost of less than 5.5% is considered cost effective. So your operation, from my perspective, is certainly cost effective. Yes, sir.
Going back to, you don't have to go back the slide, but going back to the previous discussion around building into contracts, cost of living adjustment, based presumably on whatever the price index is or something. My assumption would be that when there have been sort of oil shocks and spikes in fuel prices, which would probably be the predominant cost that would drive these changes, I'm assuming, from year to year, that, I mean, at way, I don't know if that's true, but if that's true, what do districts traditionally do if they don't build in enough sort of wiggle room or fudge factor? Because the reason I'm asking this is if you said to yourself, well, I'm going to try to negotiate really tough and have a really low percentage increase and not participate risk on the potential downside, that my assumption is the bus companies don't have the kind of margins in which they can eat really high fuel cost increases, and districts would have to scramble and find ways to pay them more money anyway.
Yeah, typically in the bids that I do, we use not only a COLA for across the board, but we also have a built-in fuel escalator, de-escalator, where you share the risk of specifically with fuel. And typically it's set on a plus or minus 5 cents a gallon differential. And the reason we've done that is that about 9 or 10 years ago, you recall that fuel went sky high. Some contracts had a fuel escalator in them. Districts were eating a lot of fuel bills at that time. The districts that did not have a fuel escalator, the contractor ate it and then made it up in the next contract. So either way, they were going to get their money. So again, you share the risk with the school, with the contractor, and it becomes manageable.
And in a funny way, you're being more transparent about sharing the risk as opposed to trying to play games with it.
Exactly. It's all out there. The Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates the COLA every 6 months. It's on their website. It's easy to go to and look at it. And in November, you can pretty much project what December was going to be and calculate an average. It's averaged in the worst years, it was about 4.45%. More recently, the trend has been between 1.5 and 2.4%. For those contracts that basically bid the cost for 5 years and fix the cost, typical contractor increases from year to year average between 4 and 5% a year. And when you compound that over 5 years, you're about 22, 23% over the cost of the contract. This becomes much more manageable and, as you said, much more transparent in terms of how you calculate it.
Thank you.
I then looked at a cost comparison between the cost of being self-operated as opposed to contracting, took all of your costs, built them into my template, and came out with an average cost per day per bus of $286.52. And that compares very favorably with both other self-operated operations in the valley, Lower Pioneer Valley Collaborative one, Southwick Tolland being another, and also compares very favorably with your current contract costs with both Kosmeskis and with Five Star. As I said, 286, Lower Pioneers at 317, and your contract with Five Star is 298 and Kosmeska 335. While it's not always an apples-to-apples comparison, it does show you the relative cost-effectiveness of being self-operated and continuing to be self-operated as opposed to contracting out for all of it. Specialized transportation, you provide most of it with preschool and special ed with your own drivers and vehicles, presumably because it's less expensive than contracting. You do contract with Vanpool for some of it. And for those routes that you contract with Vanpool, which are basically your long-distance routes and your low-incidence routes, Vanpool can do it cheaper than you can do it. So that works out to your advantage. I looked at your equipment, and while your equipment is relatively old, it's in relatively good condition. I would suggest, in the report, I made a recommendation with regard to accelerating your capital plan for replacement of vehicles. Ideally, in an ideal situation, you want 50% of your vehicles under warranty at all times. And here you have 15% of your specialized and 44% of your regular transportation vehicles under warranty. So, transportation operations, I boil everything down into metrics. And if you look at your average scheduled load per route, you're at 40.1, and your actual is 27.5. But when you get to the bottom and you look at your load capacity ratio, you're at 71%, and you're at about 50% with your actual load. That's relatively, I will say, that's not highly efficient. But given 102 square miles and the bell schedules you have to work with, especially with your elementary schools, you're about as efficient from a practical standpoint as you're going to get with what you have. If you start looking at changing bell schedules, then it opens up the possibility of some longer routes, but more students on buses. But the cost is going to be fewer bus stops, longer walking distances to bus stops, and depending on how you change your bell schedule, it could even mean additional buses. Your route time analysis, I look at your route times are well under your tier time. Your tier time is 60 minutes. You certainly don't want students on buses 60 minutes. Yes, ma'am.
Can you define tier time?
Tier time is the time between the start of the first pickup in the morning and tier 1 to the delivery to the school. So state law allows you to have 60 minutes, up to 60 minutes for students on buses. So your tier time in the morning is 60 minutes. Most school districts either have a policy or a past practice of not wanting kids on buses for an hour.
You wanted to,
Actually, one thing I was just going to note for the committee is where you see, because I think it's relevant given the 102 square miles, 25, you see those buses that say KUZ, or KUS, KUZ. So those are Kosmeskis buses, which cover Leverett and Shutesbury. So Five Star and our buses cover Amherst-Pelham. So when you see the differences in the route times, you're looking at buses that are picking up students in Leverett and Shutesbury. And if you're looking at the ones that just have the numbers, those are not going to Leverett and Shutesbury.
How do you decide the mix of private versus contracting out?
Want me to go? I mean, I can start if you like. So I think it's typically been we've kept it pretty consistent over time in terms of having, because as the consultant stated, that our bus drivers are doing maintenance during the day. So we try to fill what's the right number of buses we have, like literal school buses we own, what's the number of maintenance staff we need, and how much time do they have between their runs, and try to understand that and then contract out the rest. So those are the criteria we use, is how many buses do we have, how many maintenance staff do we need, because they're not just drivers for us. They're with maybe one exception for a van, I'm thinking. Pretty much everyone who drives for us they're doing their runs, they're coming back, they're doing maintenance work, then they're doing the afternoon runs. So if we had more buses and we needed more maintenance, we could increase the number of runs we have versus contracted out.
And that was actually the same question I had that you just asked, which is why we got in touch with Mr. Labrie to look at this and look at what's the cost of our in-house routes versus the cost of our our contracted out routes. So ahead of our next 5-year contract or however long contract, we can have that discussion. What is the right mix? Does it make more financial sense to have more in-house routes, or should we have fewer in-house routes? But that question is exactly why we had this study done.
If I were doing your bids, what I would look at is the cost, bid it by route, primarily by set of routes, as it's being run now, and look at the cost compared to your self-operated cost. If you can do it cheaper in-house, you do it cheaper in-house. If you can do it cheaper contracting out, I would say contract out for it. And so it would require a little finesse in the specifications to bid by route. But the question is, do you want to maintain 3 separate vendors, yourself being one, and then 2 contracts, or do you want to try to get one company to do it all? But there are options and alternatives that you can build into the bid process to allow for various alternatives to look at multiple options.
So the contracted out portion or routes that are primarily Leverett and Shutesbury, are those just region routes, or does that include also elementary routes? And then my next question is, how does that work, because that's not this district?
So I can start with that, which is that we do have contracted out routes in Amherst as well. They're contracted for 5-star. So we do some of our own, but that's not listed on this chart. But just to be clear, Kosmeskis is the contracted out for Leverett Shutesbury. Our own routes are a mix of our own drivers plus 5-star. I'll let Mr. Margano.
Yeah, so if you think about it, so all Leverett and Shutesbury routes are Kosmeskis, elementary and secondary. We bill back the elementary schools every year for their costs based on the percentage of mileage that's for elementary school students versus secondary students. We have a transportation software that calculates that every year. So they get billed back for their share, and we keep the region share. Pelham is done by 5-star, and Amherst is a combination of 5-star and in-house drivers.
We also look at the student load analysis, and again, the blue line is your scheduled load, the red line is your actual load, and the green line is your bus capacity. And the reason that bus capacity is a wiggly line is because for high school and middle school students, you can't put 3 students to a seat. They don't fit in a 13-inch seat. And so on a 71-passenger bus, for high school, middle school, your capacity is really 47 students and not 71. And even 71 at the elementary level is packing a bus pretty tight.
And this is another chart why I wanted to make sure that the key of Kosmeskis buses being Leverett and Shutesbury is important. And sometimes those buses may have lower load, but if you think about the geographic distance both within those towns and then to get to the middle school or high school, that has to be considered as a factor on a time part. So it's just harder to be, from our perspective, and this is confirmed in the report, it's harder to be efficient with load when you're talking about rural communities that already have a trip just to get to the middle school, let alone across town.
Again, overall metrics in the afternoon parallel much of what you saw in the morning, with the exception that there were fewer students riding in the afternoon than the morning. Again, route time analysis, most of the routes operate within the transportation tier time available in the afternoon. I say most because you have one that does not. And same thing with load analysis. The actual load is under the scheduled load and pretty well under the capacity, with the exception of one bus. Route time and loading summary. For all schools, the route times are generally less than the available tier time. primarily because you do early drop-offs in the morning at your high schools. You're doing drop-offs as much as 15 minutes before bell schedule in order to create enough time for that bus to go do the second tier. In the afternoon, it's the opposite. You have buses that are arriving at the elementary schools late because they can't finish the tier 1 afternoon routes in time. So they're showing up at the elementary school as much as 15 minutes late. Again, overall, given the size of the district and the other factors affecting transportation efficiencies, we've determined that the operation is both cost-effective and as efficient as practical. And any significant increase in efficiency would result in longer routes, which would adversely affect the elementary school schedules in particular. Current school schedules, you all know what they are. Let's get the next one, Mike. This is what it looks like in our format, and you can see where you have buses that are dropping off early, especially for the buses that go out to Leverett, Shutesbury, and Pelham, in order to get there on time. Based on a route information provided, again, they're getting there 5 to 10 minutes prior to the school start, and they drop off students 10 to 20 minutes early at the Amherst Elementary School. For Tier 2, Shutesbury, Leverett, and Pelham Elementary Schools, the buses must drop off early at the Hyde Middle School in order to pick up and drop off to get there for the start of school. The school start time for Shutesbury Leverett is 20 minutes earlier than the other district elementary schools, and these times compress the transportation tier time available for Tier 1 for the high school and middle school, and for Tier 2, Leverett and Shutesbury. I make a recommendation, it may fall on deaf ears, but you may wish to consider revising the school bell schedules for Leverett, Shutesbury in order to provide the additional transportation tier time in the morning, to bring the schedules of drop-offs to schedule time and create the tier time necessary to get there, to get to the elementaries in time. Same thing in the afternoon. You can see where buses are actually getting late to Leverett, Shutesbury, and Pelham, primarily because of the length of the Tier 1 PM routes. The Amherst routes run much more efficiently. Due to the differing starting and ending times for Leverett and Shutesbury, afternoon schedule is compressed, again resulting in buses arriving at the elementary schools 5 to 10 minutes after the school end time. It appears that all the afternoon routes arrive at their respective schools on time except for bus 37. It cannot complete their high school, middle school route, and therefore operated as only a single tier route. They just can't get there in time at all.
What do the schools do with the kids for 10 minutes? Let them run rampant? Hold them in the classroom?
The bell at you're talking at the secondary school.
Yeah.
So at the secondary school,
The elementary.
Well, they're arriving early
Right.
at the high school and middle school.
Okay.
Exactly.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
So they arrive roughly at 7:30, but the bell doesn't start till 7:45. So never mind. Okay, sure.
I think your answer was no. Don't let them just run riot
Yeah.
for public consumption.
Yes,
That was
there are adults.
a
that
nice-
are- yes,
They're older kids, not younger kids.
that is true.
Ms. Cullen?
Next slide.
Oh, I think this
Sorry,
is a
Oh,
question.
I'm sorry.
If I read this graph correctly, I can't read the page number. But so you're saying that the elementary schools in Amherst are not getting there ahead of the bell schedule? Because it looks like there's 20 minutes of space there. So
That's what we call deadhead time. That's the time that they need to start their second tier route to get from the end of their last stop rather to the first stop of the next tier. So it's not really time that they could shift anywhere.
sorry, I'm looking at the AM routes.
I'm sorry. So they're getting to school at the high school, the Amherst, roughly 5 minutes early.
And then the elementary schools? How do I read that graph?
All right, the elementary schools, the start time is,
Can I help with this
yeah,
one?
go ahead.
Yeah, so our start time in elementary school is 8:50. So students generally get there, we'd like them to get there by 8:40, 8:30. And so one of the challenges is exactly what you see, that we have a number of runs that actually get to the schools a little before would be ideal. And so we've worked with the bus companies on that and provided some, tried to provide some flexibility. But because some of the routes are going to Leverett and Shutesbury, these longer runs, because the Amherst runs are less distance and less time, they tend to get there a little earlier than perhaps in a perfect world they would. Yeah, it's not a huge issue. I mean, I'd be saying it differently if it was, but the range of when they get there sometimes is a challenge when we have more range than we'd like of buses getting there. But we don't want them to get there all exactly the same moment either. So we work with it, and I think it's acceptable, but there is a little bit of extra time.
The other is, especially in the morning, you want to build in some extra time when you have inclement weather, so that on a snowy day, all the buses aren't rolling in 15 minutes late. We looked at, as requested, a 15-minute later start time. Those would be the starting and ending times, assuming that the school day would remain constant as it is today. And the reason we suggested that is that it's less of a collective bargaining issue if you don't lengthen the school day as opposed to moving the start or ending time. I won't say it's not an issue. It has been an issue in other places, but it was less an issue than increasing the length of the school day might be. And again, this is what it does. It basically shifts everything to the right by 15 minutes. It still leaves the same types of problems that you have in the afternoon for buses to get to the elementaries, the outlying elementaries on time. So you're basically just carrying the problem forward. It does enable the high and middle schools to drop off closer to their school start times, though, which is a positive pickup for that. It does result in a problem for bus 26 not being able to complete its AM route in time to pick up and deliver, but bus 31 does not currently have a morning tier 1 route, so 26 could be reconfigured and split between the two to help alleviate that problem if you went in that direction. The afternoon, same thing, you get a shift, but here you start seeing, you see a real bottleneck between finishing the tier 1 routes in the afternoon and getting to the elementaries on time. It really starts to compress that schedule. And again, maintaining the same length of the school day results in a much tighter afternoon schedule than you currently have. As you can see, bus numbers 25, 26, 27, and 31 will all have difficulty arriving at their respective schools, those being Leverett and Shutesbury, at dismissal time. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, I apologize for having so many questions, but what is that challenge more so with a 15-minute shift or than current, or is it the same?
It's more of a challenge with the shift.
So how is that if everything's moving 15 minutes?
You don't have the earlier high school drop-off to give you the tier time because you're moving the high school shifting, so you're reducing that amount of tier time that you have in the middle.
So the page 42 where it says the elementary schools shift to 9:05, that's not, that bus time is actually considering that it stays at 8:50?
Yes.
Okay.
So starting a high school, middle school 15 minutes later results in the earliest pickup of 7:45 in the morning, which is important to parents, especially working parents, as to when they get their kids out of the house. One of the unintended consequences of bell shifting is the effect on working parents and childcare. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. And the latest drop-off at 4:10 p.m. Looking at 30-minute shift, you're seeing Elementary is now starting at 9:20 with a 30-minute shift. Leverett, Shutesbury, Pelham at 9:20, but Leverett, Shutesbury at now 9 o'clock. As you start to get later and later, as you start approaching 9 o'clock, it becomes more difficult for parents with regard to childcare, before childcare in particular. One of the ramifications of doing something like that would be there might be a cost built into your early childhood or your before school program. You may have more parents participating in early school for childcare. When you start getting to 9 o'clock, 9:20, 9:15, it becomes politically difficult to do that with parents. And again, as you shift things out, you're now looking at pickups. You still have some exacerbated problems with the Leverett and Shutesbury, because all you're doing is basically you're shifting things over. The problem becomes more predominant in the afternoon than the morning. Again, you can shift to the Hyde Middle School to drop off closer to the school start times, but doing that, again, compresses your time to be able to start your Tier 2. And again, you have bus 26 that's not able to complete it anyways. And you could reconfigure 31 to pick up some of that. But what we saw is that in order to make it all work as best as you can, in other words, no worse than your current situation, it's going to require at least one more bus. Maybe two, but at least one for sure. So it's not cost neutral. Again, your PM routes, you can see here, the real tightness of that afternoon getting to the elementary schools. And by the way, and that will be a lot worse when you have inclement weather during the winter, because everything slows down.
Dana?
That cost per day figure you calculated, that's operating cost. It doesn't include depreciation on the bus.
It does not include depreciation. It's operating costs only. And the reason I do that is because when I compare it to the private sector cost, it's an apples to apples, more of an apples to apples comparison. The big difference, by the way, between a self-operated system and a contracted system is that typically they have between 22 and 26% of their cost for indirect and overhead cost, and their profit is anywhere between 7 to 12 or 15%. Self-operated systems don't have that, so you're automatically going to be about 24 or 25% cheaper than contracting just by those two factors alone, even everything else being equal. On top of that, the district pays a lot less for fuel because you buy it tax exempt than a contractor, and so you're saving about 29 cents a gallon for every gallon of diesel fuel that you use as opposed to they're using. So when you put all the little pieces together, there's a pretty good cost disparity between an efficient self-operated system and contracting. And if you look in the report, I've included information on the districts that have gone to bid most recently within the last 2 years, at least those that responded to my queries. And you'll see that the average cost this year is about $409 per day per bus across the state compared to your $286. So when you look at that across, now granted that includes the Worcesters, the Lowells, the Bostons, and a lot of urban areas, but it does, if you kind of pick and choose down that list, there's no one on that list that's less than 286. So
Why don't we finish up? You were still in the middle of going through your findings around changing start times. Why don't we finish that up and then get questions?
okay, I'm pretty much right at the end. Recommendations would be to revise the high school, middle school time to 8 o'clock and 9:05, and Shutesbury Elementary to 8:45. It's our opinion that this option would be the least disruptive to students, staff, and parents. Next slide. Program impact, high school start time 50 minutes later, middle school start time 50 minutes later, Pelham Elementary School start times 15 minutes later. Again, the Leverett and Shutesbury 15 minutes later, but they all maintain the length of their school day. Parents could continue to drop off their elementary school students at the before school program as early as 7 o'clock. No students are picked up prior to 6:52. Current first pickup is 6:37. Latest elementary is 4:10, and that's at Leverett. And important to parents is that the high school students arrive home before the elementary school students for sibling childcare. That has been an important consideration for working parents. They want their high school kids home to take care of the little kids when they get home. Cost impact, using all available tiers, there's not a significant cost increase for the 15-minute. Could be a cost for your before school program. Length of the school day is not changing. Collective bargaining should be minimal. There might be an impact with high school athletic schedules if not everyone in your conference is changing bell schedules. That may be negatively impacted.
Just very briefly, at the current time, we typically don't have many games, or not all of them play games, meets where students leave before 3 o'clock. So I think it, for our purposes, pretty minimal, because while students certainly get out before then, there's after-school help until 3 o'clock. So most of the practices and all that don't start till a little later. So I think there would be for us, the impact less on athletics and more on how do we provide time for students and faculty to meet if students need extra help or additional support, and that's something that would be affected potentially by this. Sorry, I just wanted to jump in on it.
Recommendation, even if you don't change the bell schedule, you may wish to consider revising the school bell schedules for Leverett and Shutesbury to increase transportation efficiency. You may wish to present any impact on any bell schedule to the community well in advance. My experience has been you want to do this at least a year in advance. While Lexington and Newton voted this past school year, they're not implementing it until the next school year. So they're having all types of breakout sessions with all of the stakeholders, not least of which there was some kickback from school staff, high school staff in particular, especially those that were running clubs after school with regard to getting out of school later. So you want the lead time to involve all of the stakeholders in whatever plan is considered by the committee.
Sterling, did you say?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So thank you so much for this very robust analysis. I think, for real, this is exactly the kind of data we need in advance of the more values kind of, back and forth discussion. So having this as a foundation is really helpful. So is it a fair interpretation that the biggest logistical problem with the 30-minute shift is the inclusion of the routes for Leverett and Shutesbury Elementary?
Yes.
Okay. So follow-up question, Dr. Morris. So those two schools are not part of our region. Obviously, we do a lot with other districts. Could you explain for the committee, just in general, the nature of our agreement with those districts? When it comes to transportation and what and managing contracts and what we're committed and obligated to.
So actually, Mr. Mangano probably can answer that one better than myself.
So it's a practice. It's a practice that's been in place for at least the last 10 years, maybe longer. The advantage to our district is we get to share the cost of a bus with them. So instead of us paying for a full bus just for 7th graders through 12th graders, we get to share that bus with them. We get about $120,000 a year to offset our costs that we would most likely have anyway. We might be able to trim out a few buses, but we would most likely have anyway to bring our secondary students to school.
One of the other advantages you have of having a relationship with Leverett and Shutesbury is that when you go to bid, you have a larger economy of scale for people to bid on. One of the biggest problems in bidding is when you're a small district trying to get someone else interested in your contract. So the larger economy of scale you have, the more attractive you look to other bidders. In past years, we did bids countywide in both Franklin County and Berkshire County in order to create the economy of scale. In often cases, we split the bid up several ways, but it did get attractive to other bidders.
Great. Other questions? What I want to do is maybe start at one end of the. You can jump in 2 seconds.
Yeah.
Put
my hand down.
I'm just wanting. I just want to be as efficient as possible, respectful of your time. But Dr. Morris, you get first. If you have a question, I'll be surprised. But you can make a comment.
I was just going to add that this report and the slides have been shared with Superintendent Haggerty of Union 20, because I'm just respectful. Of
That is
Mr.
actually
Sullivan's-
very helpful. Not just because of the recommendations, but well, no, because there was a bunch of them that were in there that were like, Shakespeare and Lever ought to think about this. And it's like, and then you'll leave, and we'll be like, whatever happened with that? I hope they just read the report. So if you have
So,
anything, we're just
yeah,
gonna run out of the table.
I brought this up as a update to my Tewksbury School Committee actually last Thursday, and I received the death stare from all the school committee members, the principal, and the superintendent.
Okay.
Going around the table? Okay. So I feel like there are two really separate issues. There's the start time, and then there's the fact that we're about to have our contract go commit. So, I guess I'll start with some of my questions about the opportunities and the challenges that having a new contract might pose. And just, we just talked about the climate strike. Have you worked with districts that have tried to lower their carbon footprint by negotiating better, either in-house somehow buying a greener fleet or negotiating with, are there companies out there that you might pay a premium for to get a greener fleet of buses?
This past year, we did a bid for South Shore Regional, and we went to a complete propane fleet of buses. Because the economics there worked out very well. The payoff was less than 3 years. And the reason being is that they did not have to construct a propane fueling station. Their propane vendor agreed to wet fuel their buses in the yard every night. And so it was very cost effective to do that. We've looked at electric buses, and in a large geographic area like this, I would not recommend electric buses at this time. They don't have the longevity capacity to run routes this long consistently. And I would wait till the technology gets a little better before I would look at electric buses. The other is that electric buses are very, very expensive to buy in comparison to gasoline or diesel buses or even propane buses.
Yeah, I think two more questions. One
Although the caveat would be, you certainly could use propane buses if you had if the town was going to go greener and share the cost of a fueling station with the town, then it might be attractive, at least for the Amherst buses that don't run the long distances for Shutesbury, Leverett, and Pelham. So you could do it with some, but the economy of scale is, the cost of a fueling station and fueling, and if you're not doing your whole fleet, and if you're not sharing it with the town, could be cost prohibitive.
Yeah, it's just good to hear that.
Yeah, and the incentives that have been around for a while are slowly going away.
So, and this is kind of, just because we have this opportunity, I'm thinking a little outside the box, so this might be a little bit, but I'm thinking about some of the communities you mentioned have a lot of public transit. And, having lived a long time in New York, kids in New York City, they take public transit to school. We have the PVTA here. Are there any reasons or opportunities we might and maybe this has been discussed before, but it seems like one thing we could do to be greener might be try to push some kids or encourage some families to potentially use public transit that are already out there. Is that something that you've ever seen in other communities?
Yes.
Or we've
Yes.
considered? I see Sean waving.
No,
Yeah.
Taunton and Fall River both have a large participation rate for the high school students with their PVTA, although it's not called PVTA, but with their public transit system, to the tune of about $240,000 that they spend on bus passes. The advantage to the student is that the bus pass is good 24/7, so they get to use it anytime, anywhere they want. The advantage to the district is you're reducing your ridership on buses. So.
Sean's
Dr. Morris, go ahead.
So we are going to send the bid specs to PVTA,
great.
and we're going to reach out to them ahead of time to kind of see, like, is the way our spec's structured now, does that allow them to potentially compete or not? But we do plan to send it to them.
And by the way, there was a court case against PVTA by private contractors saying that they were infringing upon their business practices. That case was dismissed by Superior Court about 3 years ago. So it is permissible under law, now that there is case law, to use public transit. The only caution we have with regard to public transit is that PVTA in this case would need to query their drivers and fingerprint their drivers and go through the safety checks that any yellow school bus driver would have to go through.
So just briefly on the safety front as well, when this has come up in the past, district staff, myself included, have expressed some concern about non-school students on PVTA buses. So one thing that we know is our drivers are fingerprinted and around criminal safety check, but they're on buses with the general public, and while I think that's wonderful in many ways, there is some question both legally around liability that I've heard from other superintendents. So if something was to happen on a bus that we're encouraging people to go on with a member of the public, but more importantly, just from a safety perspective, can we guarantee the safety of students if they're on a bus that we don't operate, that has members of the public along with them? So those are just concerns. I'm not suggesting or trying to say the idea is not worth pursuing, and as you hear, we are looking into that. But those are concerns that I've heard from both staff as well as community members when this topic has come up in the past.
The caution is that you bear liability for what happens on a public bus, because it's a school-sponsored event.
Ms. Pitzer, anything else?
I guess the other thing was just about the school, shifting the school time, and as a parent who works, I think the biggest challenge is gonna be this question of how do we get our kids on the buses, and I'm assuming like this it's great that we have the 7 a.m. program, but if it's in one more stop in the morning that you need to make personally, rather than the convenience of having the bus come up, my bus is not in front of my house, it's a little bit of a walk, but it's just it's going to be challenging, and I think it's good to I like your recommendation of talking about it as early and as often as you can.
Only that I look forward to an additional discussion. I always imagine 30 minutes as the floor, not the ceiling. This is pretty sobering, but it's good so that we can have real data, so that when we do a pro-con analysis and then decide what to do, we'll have good data back in it.
I agree, thank you. This is like, I didn't have a chance to read the full report, just the PowerPoint. So it's super helpful, and I apologize for asking all these questions, but I'm still a little confused on my questions, because I understood, and maybe this is my understanding, it's incorrect, that what you were analyzing was shifting all bell schedules 15 minutes and all bell schedules 30 minutes. So I'm confused as to why the challenges in those later start times are different than what we have today, because presumably you're moving tier 1 and tier 2 the same amount of time. So why isn't it just the same challenges, just at different times?
Because with your right hand, what we're doing is we're also bringing the high school routes closer to their start time to alleviate the early drop-offs at the high school and middle school as part of this process. And what that does is it reduces the tier time available when they end at the high school to start. Because in order to make those routes work, they have to drop off at the high school, middle school 10 to 15 minutes early now.
Right now.
Right now.
Right.
And if you take that away and make them get to school on time or closer to on time, you're taking 10 or 15 minutes away from the time that they have to start their second set of routes.
So
And
if you didn't include that, it would just be, if we kept that same sort of 10 to 15 minute early arrival time and we kept that the same, then it really would just be the same challenges we have today, just
The
shifted.
15 minutes works with pretty much the same way you have today with the same issues, because the two major issues with bus 26 and 31 can be reconfigured in Versatran to make that problem less of a problem. When you get out to 30 minutes, you have 5 buses that you would need to reconfigure somehow, and you really don't have the excess capacity in the other buses to be able to do that without adding at least one bus.
Right, but if you kept all the same routes arriving 10 to 15 minutes early that are arriving 10 to 15
The
minutes
problem
early
would be
right now.
less. The problem would
Okay.
be less, yes.
Yes? Anything else?
So yeah, and it is an issue. So the elementary is not so much an issue about when the kids get there. At the secondary level, it is an issue. Our students are getting there at essentially the same time as our staff. And so we pay staff to come early, certain staff members to be there early to do that work, but it does lead to problems, and I think this wasn't something I talked to Rich about before that he did the study. It's something that he noticed that our staff talk about quite frequently. So, but I think just delineating it's two things. One is moving the start time back. The second is solving this problem of how early students are getting there to secondary level.
Another way of fixing it would be to change the length of your school day, which we did not recommend in this report. We did not look at it because of the potential collective bargaining issues that opens up. And the other is that we never recommend changing a bell schedule for the sake of.
The community does not necessarily understand. And so I think, to have one committee member, Ms. Spitzer earlier mentioned that there are two issues at stake here, and the way that you've presented this report in the PowerPoint presentation definitely bring that home. That if we're going to have conversations about later start times, that we also have to have a conversation about what our transportation schedules look like and what we're actually trying to achieve there. I think, at this point, it's important for us to continue to have this conversation out loud, as you've suggested, frequently for a very long time, so that we're allowing people to provide their input and their feedback. I also, just, a couple of comments. I think because this is so confusing, and I share, my colleagues' confusion as well, even just with this explanation that's been given to us. I think it's important for us to be able to simplify the explanation as much as possible, and perhaps provide some scenarios that people can relate to. So you kept referring to bus 31 and bus 26. I think those two can become our sample buses, right? Like bus 25 or bus 26 rather leaves this town at this time to pick up this. And basically make it almost like a problem paragraph that we are sharing, because I think that will help people's understanding of what we're actually, of what's being discussed here in the times. I think that also this conversation really draws home for me that if we want to both achieve, quote unquote, higher efficiency in some respects, but also have this conversation about the later start times, that we actually also have to address the question about perhaps adding additional buses, right? And at some point, that becomes a very complicated question for us and difficult one to achieve, because we understand that regional transportation costs have gotten so out of control, and at the same time that the state reimbursement for transportation has also declined. So it is a multi-tiered conversation, but at the same time, I think that the community cares enough, because it's a rural district, about how we achieve, bus pickups and drop-offs, and how we get our students safely back and forth from point A to point B, that we have to present that as an option. If we actually want to achieve the goal of shifting start times, then this would mean we need to add a bus, or we need to add 2 bus lines, and it's not a conversation that I think we would go into lightly, but is an important conversation to have with this community, with all the different communities that are involved. And then I guess my last point is just, about the green, green options. I grew up in an urban city, a very large environment, urban environment, and oftentimes public transportation was the only way to get to school. And so I think that I could see how some families, or a lot of families, would actually be quite comfortable with that, especially if it means achieving our, climate efficiency goals in this town, which we've also placed a high premium on. So I would want to have that conversation around an efficiency study. I don't think we can actually talk about achieving efficiency around transportation without including that in there. I'm glad to hear from Mr. Mangano that we are already exploring, with PVTA, an option for that. I look forward to hearing more about that and then seeing how we might be able to build that into this, at a future date.
If the committee is serious of looking at that as an option, what I would recommend is that when you do your next set of bid specs, you build in an alternative for propane buses or electric buses and see what the contractors come back with for a cost. And, and then at least you'll have real numbers with regard to whether it's cost prohibitive or not.
Thank you.
Thank you for explaining the complicated details that go into transportation person from bus to school. But a question that may describe my complete misunderstanding of this. A couple of years ago, when they said, oh, let the high school students start later, up in Pelham, we said, well, the Pelham kids will start earlier. But that's not why was that not an earlier start time for grade schools and a lot later start time for high schools?
I wasn't here then. I have no idea.
Okay. Okay.
I will just offer one other thing. As you read the report, you're likely to have additional questions. If you just email them to Sean or to Mike, he'll forward them to me, and I'm happy to answer questions ongoing through your whatever process you deem to use.
That's deeply appreciated. I mean, as you can see, the committee's digging in. There's a lot of information in there, and it is literally impossible that we've heard the last question. I mean, not just from the community or the staff, but also literally just from the committee itself. Dr. Morris?
Yeah, just briefly, so when this was looked at, we started this conversation last year, and we looked at the report that was done, I want to say it was 2012, but the years might be, I might be off on that, and that was the recommendation. The community feedback was substantially negative towards that, for some of the reasons that were cited here about younger
You mean
students
flipping
the
times.
elementary and the secondary. One was because the younger students would get home before the older students, and so for childcare for many families that was a problem. Also, it pushed the secondary schools back much further than what's being talked about here, which one could see as a positive, but had large implications for after-school activities, including sports. So certainly could go down that way, but I think Mr. Fonch, if he was here, would he could better than I could, frankly, detail some of the concerns that arose when we looked at that.
Where it has worked and worked relatively well has been going to a three-tier system. High school, middle school, elementary. Putting your middle school in tier 1, moving your high school to tier 2, and leaving your elementaries pretty much where they are. That's been the model that's been adopted in several school districts, Concord in particular, and that seems to be working pretty well right now. And that's the model that Lexington is moving to next year if they in fact implement.
So,
It wasn't a report question, but do you have any experience with putting on-spots on buses? Because Shutesbury, I've been in informal talks with Pam Kosmeskis, and she said she'd be willing to do it if it was in the contract and everyone had to. But, because Shutesbury is 16 miles of paved roads and 15 dirt. And
it's an on-spot?
On-spots are it's like a series of chains that can, fuel trucks have them, and some UPS.
They drop down.
They drop down either
I've seen
hydraulically or
those.
air, and they're not like putting chains on your tires,
Yeah.
but they'll do the same thing in a quick emergency
Yeah,
where
yeah,
you
yeah.
need a little bit of help.
Sure.
And I just wondered if you had any experience.
The only school district that I know that's using them is Mohawk Trail. And there it's not because of snow, it's because of mud.
Yeah.
Sullivan knows that well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I went over my 15 minutes.
While the committee is fascinated by, you kicked off a great conversation for us. We deeply appreciate it. Appreciate your willingness to answer other questions.
Thank you very much.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I am going to bring up the uncomfortable point that it is 9:05. I think we have a policy around how long we go, don't we? Can you remind me of the policy?
It's 2.5 hours.
2.5 hours. So we're at 2.5 hours now, I think, are we? A little past it. Yes?
I move to extend our meeting by half an hour.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Moved and second. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of extending the meeting by half an hour, raise your hand. Any opposed? Any abstentions?
Abstain.
Okay, okay, so it's 701, one abstention. We're on for another 30 minutes. Mike, Dr. Mike, Superintendent Mike, whatever you want to call yourself. I'm sorry. We need to think about excising things off of our agenda.
So, I think the things, and I'm looking at Mr. Mangano a little bit, I think the things that I'd like to see happen tonight are approving the student activity accounts.
Sorry, what?
Parts 7C, approve student activity accounts.
Hold on. Things we eliminate or things we
Oh,
keep?
no, things that I'm prioritizing.
Okay, that's why I'm
Yeah.
asking you.
Yeah, yeah,
You weren't-
so-
I wasn't clear.
Oh, I'm
So
sorry.
you want to
about
make sure we keep 7C
that. And 7E.
and 7E. Is there timeliness to 7F?
Yeah.
I think there
Timeliness to
is,
7F
and 7G.
and 7G.
I think my opinion is the other topics perhaps could wait till October.
Okay, you okay with 7D?
Yeah, I gave you guys the highlights, so.
Okay, does the committee object? So reordered. Okay, student activity accounts. I mean, I still don't know if we're gonna hit the half an hour mark, but we are now making a good faith effort to try to do so.
It's point of policy, right?
I'm gonna be as efficient as possible. Except for all these copies out ahead of time.
Thanks, Sean.
Okay, just have one for Silo. Okay, so student activity accounts. One thing the committee hasn't really done in the past because we haven't brought it to the committee, but we should do going forward, is an annual approval of student activity accounts. And so I've listed all of the existing student activity accounts that have balances, and then there are 4 new student activity accounts that are being proposed, and I'll explain more about those. So again, quick overview of student activity accounts. Kids at the high school, middle school have passions about certain things. They form a club. That club usually will have an advisor of some sort, which will help them engage in that passion, usually after school. They're also used to track like sport teams that do fundraising for their specific sport. It's used to track like the grade, like if a grade raises money for their class of, we use student activity accounts to track that. And basically it's money that's fundraised by students that is then spent by students. They're really the ones who decide how those monies get used. A lot of your field trips, that's how they get paid for. So there is a long list because Amherst is a very passionate community, as you all know. You'll see a long list of different clubs that have monies in them from past years. And some of these will ultimately probably be brought back to you at some point to be closed because they haven't been active for several years. But at this point in time, they all have funds in our accounting system. So it's broken down to middle school on the first page, and then there's a page and a half of high school. And so the first motion would be to approve the list of existing student activities. And then there's a second motion to approve a new student activity account. I've got one listed here. Liz Haygood, who you all met during one of our strategic program reviews. She is our student activity coordinator. She actually had 3 other ones that she wanted me to get approved tonight, so I'll read those to you now.
Does that mean you'd want that bottom motion amended to include? the
Yeah, I'm
amendments?
gonna have to have that amended.
Don't feel overly rushed, by the way.
Sorry, I apologize. You know, I do
Sprint
too,
me.
but
You can
we're
get
gonna go with it. So the new ones will be student government. So it's explained to me that it's different than student council. Student councils are sort of grade specific. Student government is a club at the high school that's going to be sort of focused on the whole high school, and it's a group that would meet with the principal periodically. Another new one being proposed is what is it? SIAC, which is it's a youth action committee that's going to take on youth initiatives basically and fundraise around those initiatives. And then the last one is the Anti-Semitism Awareness Club.
Pardon me?
The Anti-Semitism Awareness Club. So those 3, in addition to the one that's listed already, which is a new account to track a field trip for the performing arts group. They have a large field trip that's going to be taking place annually, and they want their own account to sort of track the fundraising and expenditure of those funds.
Mr. Dillon?
I move to establish new student activity accounts for the Performing Arts Field Trip, Student Government, SIAC, and the Anti-Semitism Awareness Club.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded by Ms. McDonald. Any further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor, signify by raising your hand. It carries 8-0. Any further motions, Mr. Marston?
Did we
Were
get
you
the-
finished with your discussion, or?
Yeah, and so there's one other motion, which would be to approve the existing.
No, I know that, I saw that.
Yeah, I'm done
But
with
the way,
the,
the way the
done with the
superintendent was
overview.
looking,
Yep.
I thought there was like some important thing you left out that he wanted you to say.
Nope.
So seeing that's not the case, Mr. Demling, I recognize you again.
I move to approve the student activities listed above.
Is there a second? Ms. Ordonez?
Second.
Moved, seconded by Ms. Ordonez. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion, signify by raising your hand. It carries 8-0. Thought we already closed the class of 85.
Yeah, we closed some of these. They have to be brought back to be reclosed. What I'll do is send you all, just so you can see the activity. I'll get you a printout of just the current balances in all of these accounts. So you just have a sense of the scale and the total that's in student activities.
Did you say, by the way, that you wanted some indication from the class of how it should be donated or something like that?
Yeah, so
or-
there's a couple older classes,
I know.
respectfully.
Yeah, I know. I'm aware of that. Thank you very much.
That I mean, like, if you look at most of our classes, we have a new policy where when the students leave the district, we make them take the money with
Yeah.
them. But there were a couple classes that snuck through in the 80s and 90s.
Forgive me for saying this on camera, but if you still need something for 85, double check.
I remember you told me
There's
that
a
was
guy
your
named-
class,
no,
right?
There's a local guy named Micah Winston, who's a
Okay.
classmate of mine, who's almost like the deputy class president
Okay.
to Mike McIntosh, who lives out in Wisconsin,
Okay.
and Micah can help.
All right.
figure out how to
Perfect.
do
Yeah,
this.
absolutely. That makes sense.
Yes, Ms. Ennis.
Just a comment to, I guess, highlight the point that you just made, Mr. Mangano, about providing a printout of, the remaining amounts that are
Yeah.
in these accounts and which ones have been signals for closing and which ones
Yep.
are still open, because I find it really difficult to gauge,
Mhm.
what's happening with these when we're just
Right.
seeing a list of names.
Yep.
So I think that for all future conversations, honestly, about these accounts, we really
Mhm.
should just have the numbers.
Sure. Yeah, and I'll send you that this week so you can get a sense, because
That'd be
it's a
great.
printout we can just run.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That'd be great. Pool is issued.
All right, so somewhere in this packet, there's a spreadsheet on the pool.
It's right after the PowerPoint slides that were just presented, so I would guess about 2/3 of the way in.
So I reran the numbers based on the schedule, tentative schedule that could change a little bit, using the $25 per hour rate during the week for pool usage and a $30 per hour rate during the weekend. And it generates the fees as shown there. So there's a table for LSSC and there's a table for the Tritons. So the total projected to be brought in, and they've not accepted these rates yet, but this is for you all, and then I'll propose it to them. The total that we would be projected to bring in is about $32,000. We think our costs to maintain the pool sort of to this extent throughout the entire year is going to be somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000 in terms of direct costs for custodial OT, chemicals and supplies, and testing of the pool periodically, which leaves somewhere around $10,000 to $12,000 that can go into our pool revolving fund to be used for capital improvements, which again, the pool's 60-something years old, so it's going to have improvements needed periodically.
Mr. Morris, did you say? I saw your hand. Are there questions? So you're saying you have not discussed this with them yet?
Not yet.
And you're looking for an
yeah.
indication from the committee as to whether we wish to move forward with this?
It's lower than what we were looking at before, which was $30 flat throughout basically every day of the week. So it is a reduction to reflect that they're using our pool more, so sort of some scale, but also that they're transitioning from Topman, which had a really low historical rate.
Okay. Are there questions from the committee? Yes, Ms. Dowd.
So you mentioned that it's a recognition of the transition, but is it anticipated that it would remain at 25 for the foreseeable future?
I think we have to look at it every year,
Every year, okay.
to look at to track it, and I think that'll be part of when we review our facility use procedures, that we include the pool as part of those facility use procedures and how the rate gets determined annually.
Got it.
So does that mean that the motion that appears on the following page should say move to approve the pool usage hourly rates as described above for FY20.
Yes, yep.
Are there further questions? Seeing none, anyone want to say out loud what I just suggested saying? Yes, sir.
I move to approve the pool usage hourly rates as described above for fiscal year 2020.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion, questions? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by raising your hand. Nay? Abstentions? 2 abstentions. So it goes 6-0-2. The abstentions were McDonald and Ordonez.
And if there's any, so we'll propose these rates, and if it is not successful, we may be back to talk to you more.
Okay. Education reform bill.
Yes, so there is a draft letter to our representatives, that's right after the pool issue in the packet. So basically, and I'll be as quick as I can here. This is a bill that came out last Thursday that has been, well, in some respects, 25 years in the making. It's the last time that ed reform was really tackled at this level. This is coming out of Foundation Budget Review Commission from 4 years ago, and the Promise Act that this committee endorsed. It's moving pretty quickly through the State House. The Senate announced that they are accepting amendments until this Friday, and then they want to debate it next week. Word on the street is that they want to get the whole thing signed, sealed, and delivered into law before Thanksgiving, which for something of this magnitude is screamingly fast. So this is really our one opportunity to have some input. Instead of doing the 20-page here are all the reasons, I did the 1-page short and sweet summary letter format. Basically, the first section highlighting the things that are in there that seem to be very good for our district. And I have to say, these items, most of what's in the Student Opportunity Act, the focus is on helping large districts with large numbers of low-income students. As it, in my opinion, as it should be. We've talked about that, and this is the moral imperative of addressing income inequality. There was, in addition, the hope that other districts like ours would be have some things. So all these items in the things of Please Protect, none of these I would say were expected. They were hoped for, and so I think it's a pleasant surprise, particularly the commission and the study, which is really right out of S236, which is a bill that Support Mass Regional Schools is really advocating for, and the minimum local contribution ability to pay study, which should be near and dear to anyone's heart who follows regional assessments. In terms of the changes, so any of these, if we're not comfortable with, we could, strike by bullet. But just to real briefly go down why they're in there. And any change to how charter school funding, how charter schools are funded is really the biggest glaring omission in this bill. It doesn't touch it at all. So some sort of study along what has been proposed for rural and declining enrollment schools is what I thought would be reasonable. A timeline for fully funding regional school district transportation, that's another thing that for regional schools is not included, and there are other proposals to fully fund some of the unfunded mandates, particularly charter increase reimbursements. So that's a model that's already in there that would be good to advocate for. Minimum per pupil aid is something, these things I wouldn't expect them to actually get approved as amendments. But I think these are important conversations to have when the Mass Municipal Association is saying it should be at least 100, and it's at 30 in this bill. It's just something that needs to be called out. And then this last one might need a little more explanation. So on the Rural Schools Commission, if you had a chance to read the bill, it calls out what it should study, and then it itemizes the recommendations that this rural schools study should make, and it includes things like reorganizing schools and school districts, consolidating administrative, transportation, and governance functions, expanding the use of technology. So having talked with some other regional school district advocates across the state, there was a general consensus that a lot of this was reflecting some language from some of the governor's previous bills about this theme of moving control of schools towards the state level, away from the local level, forcing schools to consolidate. You may follow some issues in Vermont and other areas in New England where this is becoming an issue. And, you know, it's certainly possible that the committee could recommend those things, but at least the notion among other advocates was why put the thumb on the scale and tell them to do that in a way that seems fairly reflective of some of the governor's bills. And so this just strikes those recommendations out and says the more general reduce costs and improve educational outcomes. So that's the thumbnail sketch of how we got to here.
So the point of this would be that if we want an opportunity to weigh in, we need to either approve this, or edit and approve this, or rewrite it and approve this, like tonight. Just to be clear about this. Otherwise, we're choosing to be silent. Ms. Reno?
Is there a ballpark figure for the cost to the state of implementing this?
So the blurb is $1.5 billion to schools over the next 7 years. I think that's depending on what these commissions recommend. I think that's really an estimate, and really ties into the funding, the revenue discussion, and how the state does that. So I don't think anybody has an absolute bottom line, but it's certainly a lot more money to public schools.
They're also suggesting they can do it without raising taxes. And since I'm personally always in favor of raising taxes, I'm more than happy to have a high price tag on this thing. Is there Dennis?
I think some of the comments that I've read in recent news reports has said that, you know, the funding for this is completely unclear, and that's I think the slap back, if you will, from a lot of communities, especially those of more conservative bent, is that, you know, this is going to be an unfunded, unsustainable cost. However, doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't support it. I think the goals, you know, are clear. I think, you know, this is good, and I'm in agreement with what's stated here. I don't know where the final 4 recommendations come from. You know, they seem sound to me, but I haven't been involved in any conversations to draft these or to, you know, to come up with them. I haven't seen anybody making these kinds of recommendations other than the first bullet point, the commissioner study, which comes from previous iterations. And so I you know, I agree with that. I would recommend probably striking the sentence that's in the parentheses, and failing that, a declaration that charter school funding is inequitable and needs to be changed, because I believe we've actually stated that previously, and I know for a fact that Senator Comerford and Representative Blaze and Dom have said that. But I think that, you know, aside from some of the recommendations, like, you know, the MMA one, the third bullet point, these other ones seem sound, and I would be in support of them. I think we need a better process internally, probably, for coming through, you know, some of this stuff is moving so fast. I mean, this act was just announced this past week, so it's not giving us a lot of time to respond to it, especially within the meeting schedules that we have. But, you know, perhaps some other process internally for us to be able to assess when an act like this hits, check in with the superintendent, and to be able to draw, you know, a committee's recommended approach for this would be really helpful.
Yeah, I don't actually think there was a committee process. I think a member of the ad hoc advisory group volunteered to draft something and then brought it forward.
Yeah.
There really wasn't a process. That's not a criticism. I don't actually want to debate that. Like, there's nothing wrong with it. Dr. Morris?
So just to the question of cost, the estimates are $1.5 billion over 7 years. That's what's been reported, so I just wanted to give that, you know, I don't think anyone has narrowed it down to the penny, but I want to be responsive to the question about cost.
Sure.
So I just want to say I completely agree with everything Mr. Ardonia said. And normally, you know, I would not come up with recommendations of my own and then present them full form for a vote. It's just, it was more along the theme of what Mr. Nakajima said, which is this bill came out Thursday. Amendments are this week. This is literally our only chance. And so if there are items here that...
I think I just said that, Mr. Dunlap.
Yeah. So I just wanted to articulate that I agree with you, and it's not my preferred process to, you know, be this, like, specific in a draft. And, you know, and maybe I'm stating the obvious, but I'm not attached to any of these points. So, you know, if there are items here that are less supported than others, you know, we could strike whatever we want. So,
To be honest, it's funny you say that. I agree with the business of failing that a declaration. I think that line should be struck under the, I don't know, the fourth from the bottom, a commissioner study in charter schools. First, I mean, forgive me for saying this, a declaration on charter school funding being equitable is utterly meaningless. They could also talk about sending astronauts to the moon. At least a commission gets you on the path of getting some sort of concrete, you know what I mean? Like, I want action out of this thing. And I like the idea of calling for the commission, which you mentioned before and I echoed in a call with Chairman Lewis. We both talked about it, that being a really good idea. So I'd like to strike, 'cause I think the parenthetical weakens the earlier sentence. And then honestly, I'd also like to strike, frankly, the fourth bullet. Mainly one, because following Ms. Adonis says, the committee hasn't really had a chance to really dig in and talk about that. And the second reason is, I want to strengthen the previous three recommendations. Like, we could do lots of things with the commission, but the reality is, I want to know when we're fully funding regional transportation. I definitely would love minimum aid increased, and I think there has to be a commission on charter schools. And I think having more recommendations just dilutes the argument. Like, let's punch this thing, you know, more strongly. That's my view, anyways. Are there other opinions, Spencer?
Yeah, I just want to thank Mr. Demling for taking the time to do this in such a tight time frame, and I would agree with the earlier recommendations. And then, this is really small, but just spell out what MMA stands for.
Mixed martial arts.
Right.
Dr. Morris, on that erudite comment on my part.
Yeah, I'm not referencing that, but the only comment I had was just whether elected officials not in the school committee would want to be CCs on this, just to be aware that in the four towns that there's advocacy on this, because this is, while it's a school funding bill, it has huge impact on municipal finance. So again, that's obviously your decision to make. But
No, I
just
think it's a
one
good.
thing
I think that's a good idea.
Yeah.
I do.
We should be CCing the select boards and the town councils. They can figure out how to get to their own finance committees.
Yeah.
But we should definitely do that. Are there other comments? And by the way, I should say, since we ended up getting into this roundabout process discussion, I echo the thanks for putting this together, filling it up. And it also looks nice and tidy,
Yes.
which is always a good thing. Are there other comments? Otherwise, I'd actually accept a motion to approve as edited, if that were in order. It is in order, if someone's willing to make it. Yes.
Just before we do that, I have a question. What is MMA?
Oh, the Massachusetts Municipal Association.
Thank you.
You know what? That's the reason we need to spell it out. Otherwise, I say something
Exactly.
stupid, and it just hangs there. Yes, Ms. Jonas.
I move to approve the letter as drafted and edited tonight to Senator Comerford, Representative Blaze, and Representative Dom.
Is there a second?
I second.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, signify aye. It carries unanimously. Great, thank you. So you can coordinate to get this thing out. Okay, now on to, I think it's goal time, isn't it? Not go time. Or it's go time for you, isn't it, Dr. Morris?
Perhaps. We'll see. Trying to look at the clock and know where the 30 minutes were.
we have 7 more minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, very briefly, took the feedback from the committee last time, made edits to the draft regional goals, trying to clarify some pieces, especially goal 3 probably had the most shifting of any of the goal areas, because the feedback was such that it required more than semantic changes. And so I'm open to any feedback or potential vote by the committee tonight.
I have one change I think is important. With the LGBT, I think we need to add Q to that. I think that today the term queer is used differently than it has been in the past as kind of just something else for the LGBT. And it has taken on, at least my understanding, a meaning more precise, which is a person of fluid identity or orientation.
Yeah, and I think we could even do LGBTQ plus, which is for folks who are questioning. That's good
Yeah.
feedback. Thank you.
Okay. Are there other questions around this, or comments, feedback? Otherwise, yes?
Just if for any member of the public who's watching this, we've had a number of discussions about this, and even if we vote this fast, this is coming after many minutes of really good feedback.
I
that
was
has evolved
hoping we
these.
had passionate regular viewers who were well aware and following along with their copies at home. But that's a good point, Mr. Devlin. In case that's not the case, and I'm somehow misinformed. Yes, it's true, we talked about it a lot. Okay, failing that, any additional comments? I would love to take a motion.
I move to approve the superintendent goals for the region with the as edited for point number 1.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, signify aye. Carries unanimously.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. And we are about on point for adjournment. Do we have a gift that we need to
We do.
We have a gift. One more item. Mr. Dillon.
I move to approve the following gifts from Mary Lou Conca, number 2540, 44, 46, and 49, to support student need lunch balances in the amount of $70. The Amherst Education Foundation, number 1588, Susan Hanley, to support Robert Hanley Scholarship in the amount of $4,000, for a total of $4,070. In addition, a FY20 Rural School Aid Grant to support district efforts to increase regional collaboration, consolidation, and other efficiencies in the amount of $77,391.
It's been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded by Ms. McDonald. Any further discussion? Dr. Morris?
Just for the latter item that Mr. Demling read, you may remember that last year we got a rural aid grant for about $40-ish $1,000, and we were pleasantly surprised to know that the governor added that back into the budget unexpectedly to us, and the amount actually increased for us. It's a complex formula with population density, income, average income, and oddly enough, for our friends in Pelham, they did not get rural aid grant, but the odd mix of our 4 towns means that the region did get it, as well as one of the member towns that I don't work for.
Is
So
this really cash and aid, or is it for a particular purpose?
we do have to fill out an application, but I think it's like the conversation we spent a lot of time on tonight. It's exactly for types of things that we would be working on anyway, about how we make our current system more efficient for the member towns. It's not to
Cool.
support
You
regional
can
initiatives.
report on that in a new superintendent update soon.
I'd be happy
No,
to.
seriously,
Yeah,
substantively
no,
on it.
absolutely.
Because otherwise we're done.
Yeah.
It's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Signify aye. And it carries unanimously.
Thank you.
Ms. Adonias, do you have an additional motion?
I move to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor? Carries unanimously. We're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.